No one will complete the barrier on the Mexican border. No one wants to commit military power to defend this country. We'll defend Ukraine and Poland, but we won't defend America. What's
Yeah.
wrong with that? We know historically the Ukrainians have always been good fighters. They didn't have to go to war to prove it, but they've proven it once again. The problem is for what? What are they fighting for at this point? Virtually everything of any value in Ukraine is under Russian control. In other words, this is similar to an enemy that came into the United States and controlled the entire East Coast and then sat there. That's what the Russians have done. In other words, they've captured the scientific industrial base, the coal mines, the iron ore, the rare earths, the natural gas, the oil, everything. They're sitting on it. And that's not surprising because the people that live in those areas are overwhelmingly Russians and they speak Russian. So they're very happy to have the Russians there. But having captured that, Ukraine is left with a large agrarian sector, but almost nothing else, which means it now depends very heavily on anything that we manufacture or the Europeans manufacture. And the Europeans are effectively out of gear. They've sent most of what they had to send. The German defense minister recently said Germany really can't afford to send any more than it already has and what is promised, because if we do, we'll be defenseless. I mentioned the other day to someone that people don't realize just how bad things are in NATO. The Polish army today could probably conquer Germany in a week because the Germans just have no military power to speak of to stop them. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I think that gives everybody an appreciation for just how weak Germany is. Germany has prospered with all this cheap natural gas and oil from Russia for decades, but it has also neglected its own military establishment to the point where it's almost defenseless. When you switch to France, as a good friend of mine who's a retired general in the French army says repeatedly, Douglas, the only thing the French army is prepared to do is go on safari in North Africa. In other words, the rest of the force is designed for all of this low intensity conflict nonsense that we've been wasting time on for the past 25 or 30 years, ever since Desert Storm. So the bottom line is, yes, the Ukrainians are in a very, very bad situation. It's not going to improve dramatically, but they're going to dig in subsequent locations and try to defend against what is coming in the spring. But I don't think we're going to see much in the way of a major Ukrainian counterattack. They were talking about a counteroffensive in the springtime. I don't think we're going to see much of that. We may see some localized attacks, but not much more.
Are they just out of people or out of weapons or just?
I would say all of the above, David, all of the above. When you look at the personnel side, we see in many, many units that have been reduced in strength from 100% down to 50% or 40% or 30%. The replacements are overwhelmingly boys, 15, 16, 17, some women, and men age 40 to 60. And they're not bad people. They only have perhaps 3 weeks of preparation or training, and they're essentially sent in to fill out these units. And the Russians refer to them openly as cannon fodder. In other words, they're not very capable. There are a few special units left with hardcore professional soldiers in them, but the majority no longer have those. The majority are very weakly populated with relatively new recruits who cannot be expected to endure the hardships that their predecessors did.
So, I mean, you said earlier, Bakhmut, there's an estimated 200,000 Ukrainians have died.
Not in Bakhmut, but over 200,000 Ukrainians have died in this war, Ukrainian soldiers.
Yeah,
And it's probably much higher. I've seen estimates of 257,000. I mean, we don't know with absolute certainty, but people are over there in the hospitals and going to the grave sites, and they're able to identify large numbers of people. That's how we find out the truth, because the Ukrainian government isn't going to tell you they've taken these sorts of losses. I mean, we're in a war where the Ukrainians substitute lies for the truth. So they say, oh, no, the Russians have taken all these horrendous casualties. That's not true. We think the Russians have had about 80,000 casualties. probably 25,000 killed at the moment. And that's simply because they have this preponderance in missiles, rockets, and artillery. And 75% of the casualties inflicted on the Ukrainians come from artillery, rockets, and missiles and drones. That's where the majority of casualties come from. They're not coming from tanks and armored fighting vehicles. They're not even coming from soldiers shooting at each other. Most of it is standoff attack. In other words, long range, medium range strike.
I see. I see. When I look at this story in the Washington Post, I mean, it's pretty concerning about the safety that we're losing here in this country. It says, and the headline is, in race to arm Ukraine, U.S. faces cracks in its manufacturing might. This is by Missy Ryan, and it's surprisingly critical of the. I mean, it has a tone of kind of critiquing some of the facts on the ground there. That's surprising to me because I typically think of the Washington Post as pretty in favor of the DC establishment line on things. But it says here, research conducted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies (CSIS) shows the current output of American factories may be insufficient to prevent the depletion of stockpiles of key items the United States is providing Ukraine. Even at accelerated production rates, it is likely to take at least several years to recover the inventory of Javelin anti-tank missiles, Stinger surface-to-air missiles, and other in-demand items.
Yes. No, I think that's a very, very accurate article. And there are certain things that your viewer or your listeners need to understand. This year, we're closing in on almost $1 trillion for defense, 850 billion plus. We haven't even addressed the amount of money that goes into the intelligence systems and the black budget, which constitute billions of dollars. We have been spending a lot of money on defense. No one really knows where all the money goes. Every time we try to audit the Department of Defense, we give up because we simply don't know where all the money has gone. Now we're sitting around and we're discovering that the industrial base, which is a critical feature of national defense, has been languishing, has been allowed to rot, has been allowed to diminish in terms of its capabilities. And people are going to say, well, what happened? Well, if you start asking the generals and the admirals if they can even give you a coherent answer, they're probably going to tell you, well, we don't really look into those matters. We just look into the major weapon systems and ships, aircraft, vehicles, and so forth, which is also true for Congress, because most of the immediate benefit to defense spending for people on the Hill or for the individuals who are invested in defense comes from the big ticket items, new ships, new tanks, new this, new that. No one is looking at the potential for a real war. Remember that since 2001, we've been chasing people in bed sheets with AK-47s and sandals, occasionally some command detonated mines. You're not talking about serious opponents with armies and air forces, which is what we're dealing with right now in Ukraine and Russia. As a consequence, we're not prepared and we have no surge capacity. We used to have the ability to say, all right, we're producing, say, 10 aircraft a month. We need to produce 50, and we could ramp up and do that. We can't do that right now. And most of the weapon systems that we want to rapidly ramp up and produce in greater quantities are complex, like these missiles. You just don't start producing Javelin missiles on an assembly line. You've got lots of people who are physically assembling the components to make these precision guided weapons work. So we can't keep up. On the other hand, over the last decade or two, the Russians have focused their attention once again on their industrial base and their ability to rapidly ramp up, surge, and produce vast quantities of equipment and weapons and ammunition. So now they are operating 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, turning out huge quantities of ammunition, missiles, rockets, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery systems, and so forth. We can't keep up with that. And neither, obviously, can the Ukrainians, because they're dependent on us for supply. And what I just discussed doesn't even exist in most of Europe right now. Very few European states have much of an industrial base committed to the production of military equipment. They've given it up because the Europeans depend entirely on us for their defense.
Yeah, it doesn't look good. So we're not in a situation because of this conflict. We're basically putting ourselves in a very dangerous situation in terms of any type of attack, right? I mean, we don't have the resources. I mean, I don't know. Maybe someone who's a military expert would say, "Oh, the things that we're low on, we don't really need right now. It's not an immediate thing. We have many other means of defense that are far more important that we have plenty of. So don't, this is a false narrative to be alarmed about."
Well, we've historically relied very heavily on air power to compensate for weaknesses on the ground. Not enough troops and not enough firepower. And that's fine when you're dealing with a weak opponent. But now you're talking about an opponent who has an extensive theater, air, and missile defense system. And if we were to fly most of our aircraft against the Russians right now, we would take heavy losses. In other words, the days of flying with impunity are over. And we can't afford, in most cases, to lose a lot of aircraft and pilots because, frankly, we don't have that many to begin with on the ground. What you're pointing to, David, is very important, and everybody needs to understand this. When we made the decision to build up this Ukrainian force, which was aimed at harming Russia, and we spent 8 years plus doing that, we didn't think through the consequences of our actions. We continued to dismiss Russia as, the well-armed gas station. Remember, it's a single commodity system. What can it do? Its economy is weak. Its social cohesion is poor. Its leaders are corrupt. Why are we worried about the Russians? Well, what we're discovering is the exact opposite. Russia was much, much more than just oil and gas. Russia is one of the major food producers in the whole world. It has an abundance of resources. So we haven't been able to do any harm to the Russian economy on the scale that we'd hoped. In fact, Russia is doing better now. Its currency is stronger now than it's been in decades. It's actually profited from this war. And it's refocused its exportation of food and resources to other countries: China, India, Africa, Southeast Asia, the Middle East. We didn't think through what we were doing. And now it's not just a question of ourselves, but we have a nation called Ukraine that's being destroyed. It's probably down to 18, 19 million people. Virtually all the women are gone and the children, and you're running out of manpower. Anybody who can get out is running out. And meanwhile, the Russian armed forces are larger than they've ever been, and they're being expanded to 1.5 million. Everything that underpinned, all of the assumptions that underpinned our operations from the beginning were false. Now we're in a very dangerous position.
And it doesn't seem like it seems horrible to be sacrificing, you know, uh, young kids, 15, 16 and 16, 70. But I guess in their mind, some of these are being forced to the front lines to fill in units, like you said. And it's horrible to consider that, because a lot of these people, they don't have any choice. And then some of them, they truly believe that, this is, I mean, and it is in some ways, an existential threat from their opinion, right? I mean, if you're someone who
Well,
believes that Russia is,
we got to go back to the beginning, David, and
yeah,
say, what was it that the Russians wanted? The Russians wanted Ukraine to be neutral. They did not want it to become part of NATO because they saw this dangerous force emerging in eastern Ukraine that was designed to attack them. They wanted the Russians who live in Ukraine to have equal rights before the law. The Ukrainians had essentially reduced the Russians to second and third class citizens. They were being oppressed. They were not granted equal access to resources and opportunity. The Russians simply said, look, this is a multinational state called Ukraine. You've got almost a third of your population is Russian, and wanted equal rights for those Russians. And then finally they said, look, stop the nonsense about Crimea. Crimea has been Russian since 1776. Stop talking about retaking Crimea. Recognize the legitimacy of control of Crimea by Russians. Well, the Ukrainians refused to do that. And we backed them and said, no, don't do that. So finally, exasperated with us because we pushed NATO to the very borders of Russia when we said we never would. And we put a dangerous force on their borders, which was preparing to attack them. They finally intervened militarily. But even when they went in, initially, they went in with a very small force with the intention to do as little damage as possible, because they thought that if they demonstrated they were serious, that we in turn would immediately say, all right, that's far enough. We don't want a war. No one wants a war. We'll negotiate an end to these troubles, and we'll find a new arrangement that works. Well, the Russians were wrong, and they discovered this, and basically by the summer, it was obvious that no one was going to be honest with them and negotiate with them. So they changed their approach, and they decided to organize for total war, real war.
Yeah.
Well, that took a few months. They're ready. They've got it. They're ready to wage total war. We're not. The Ukrainians are worse off now than they've ever been. So it's a tragedy for everyone, but no one in Washington is interested in bringing it to an end. And it's very dangerous, because the longer this lasts, not only is the worse is it for Europe and Ukraine, but there's always the danger that we will do something stupid and be drawn into this. Remember, we've put a lot of forces in Poland. We've got 50,000 troops there. And then we have another 50,000 spread in Lithuania and down in Romania. The Poles have mobilized about 200,000 men, and they've got about 50 to 70,000 ready to fight. I don't know what the situation is in Romania, but we have evidence that the Romanians have some number of forces ready to go with us. And there is still talk behind the scenes about intervening on the ground in Western Ukraine with this conventional force. Well, the Russians are up to what, 740,000, and they're still building and still mobilizing and still equipping and still turning out new equipment and weapons and capabilities. This is a catastrophe. We don't want to be drawn into this. We don't want a wider war, but no one is willing to step forward and say enough's enough. We need to end this and find some sort of arrangement with which all the sides can live. No one will do it.
So Washington wants this war to continue more than Poland and so forth, these other neighbors?
Well, I think the Poles believed from the beginning everything that Washington said, and assumed that the Russians would have long since collapsed, and we would have scored some sort of victory against the Russians using Ukrainian manpower. That never happened. And I think the Poles are beginning to see the danger. Initially, the opinion polls supported war with Russia. Now they're starting to turn. And I think there are members of the Polish government that are beginning to question the wisdom of intervening. But you still have a majority there in the government that does want to take on the Russians, would like to go in and occupy some of the territory, which, from their standpoint, they controlled for hundreds of years and lost as a result of the Second World War. Now, I don't know how serious that is, but I think that the danger of something like that occurring and involving us with our forces on the ground is huge. And I don't see any evidence that we, or for that matter, the Germans or the French or anybody in Europe, let alone the United States, is interested in going to war with Russia. I just don't see it. I haven't seen it in the polls. And I don't see Americans cheering on the movement of hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops to Eastern Europe to fight the Russians in Ukraine. I don't see it. So the question is, if there's really no support for that, what do we do? And I think the plan right now is to let this thing run. And now I'm beginning to see new distractions. Now we're starting to talk about the evil Chinese and the China threat. And now we even have Lindsey Graham saying we should attack Mexico. I mean, it strikes me as ludicrous nonsense. We started this war in Eastern Europe with the Russians. We don't want to end it. We're afraid to finish it in some way that'll make us look bad. And so now we're turning to other areas of the world where we want to create hostilities. It's insane. We can't afford any of it. Our economy is in terrible shape.
And of course, Matt Gaetz, the congressman from Florida, is trying to push a bill, I think this week, to try to use the war powers to resolve the Syrian troops. I didn't even know we had troops still in Syria, but I guess, that's still going on over there. So is that something that they could Could they go and scapegoat Syria to try to save face and punch on somebody else for a little bit?
Look, there was an attempt, there was a vote in the House about removing troops from Syria, and all of the lobbies, foreign and domestic, everyone with an interest in the defense industries. My impression is the Israel lobby and other lobbies all gathered together and said, no, we cannot leave Syria under any circumstances. And so the Congress, which responds to the people that donate to their reelection campaigns, voted against it. I think we have 800 to 1,000 people on the ground in Syria. It's an illegal occupation, but of course, we don't pay any attention to international law unless it suits our purpose.
Why is
And
Assad tolerating it? He just is not bothering him or something, or why is
well,
he?
I think Assad has had trouble just holding on to his own country and maintaining himself in office. He's not in a position to challenge the United States militarily, and we can always support those troops on the ground with enormous air power.
And which part are we occupying where there's assets and resources?
It's over on the northeastern side of Syria, down to the very southern tip that touches Iraq. There's a whole strip of land there that had some oil on it. You recall that there people talked about, well, we have the oil wells now that are up in these areas, and that'll help offset the cost, which of course is nonsense, never did. And we have collided there with the Turks, with the Russians, and we variously claim that we're there to protect Israel's interests. Although from personal experience, the Israeli Defense Force is very competent, as is the Mossad. I'm not sure we're doing them very many favors, but that's neither here nor there. We think that we're protecting the Kurds, and of course there are Kurds that want to use us. Again, this is a sort of wag the tail story. Wherever you go in the world, when you're a power like the United States, you're visiting. We don't live there. And everybody wants to use us for their agenda. And you have Kurdish elements that want to fight with the Turks. You have Kurdish elements that want to fight against Assad. You have Kurdish elements that are friendly to the Turks.
Yeah.
You still have elements of Islamist terrorists operating there that are supported, incidentally, by Mr. Erdogan in Turkey, that the Russians have been trying to eradicate. We tried to eradicate them. We're sort of in a stasis mode there. But the real question is, why are we there at all? Whose interests are being served? And we can point to other countries, but how is our interest served there? What is our strategic interest? No one addresses it. Well, that's because, truthfully, we have no strategic interest there.